Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the School of Innovation. I'm your host, Yaniv and today we are talking about how to light a spark of innovation and entrepreneurship in academia. I'm joined by my colleague, Andrew Maxwell. Andrew is a professor at the Lassonde School of Engineering at York University in Toronto, where he teaches courses in technology entrepreneurship, Renaissance engineering, and technology commercialization. Andrew's career uniquely combines business experience, economic development activities, and academic excellence. So, let's get right into it. I hope you enjoy. Hey, Andrew, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking the time to speak today. Because you have such a fascinating and extensive background, and I know our time today is short, I'd like to just go ahead and jump into the questions. Is that okay?
Absolutely fine. I'm glad to be here.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's start with your career innovation. You've been studying, teaching, and practicing innovation at the intersection of academia, government, and business. So what I would really like to do today is explore these different domains of innovation and hopefully glean some insights from your experience.
Sure.
Cool. So first, I really want to know, how did you get started in innovation and what steps led you to where you are today?
So that's a very good question, and I think I should start by giving my background is both engineering and business,
Okay.
and that kind of leads to some interesting insights into how technologies can address major issues. And as you get more interested in technology, you realize its technological advances can actually solve some big problems that exist in companies, in societies, in government.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of my career has actually been either launching new technologies inside organizations or launching technologies developed by companies, big companies and startups, to customers. In each case, the interesting thing is it always required behavioral change. And so the common theme of all of my work has been that it's not as much, it's that successful innovation in my space, which is usually involving technological change, is more about understanding behaviors and organizational change than it is about the technology.
That's a super interesting point. Do you have any background in that, in behavioral change and behavioral economics or anything like that?
Well, so first of all, I mean, I've developed some, and my PhD was really all on behavioral, what would be generally called behavioral economics, even though I did it in an engineering school with the Faculty of Management Science. I think the closest I come to it is the fact that my wife, that's exactly what she does. So she has an MBA and a psychology undergraduate degree, works in change management, leadership development, and many of these other areas. So part of the beauty is that we talk, I discuss interesting things in my PhD, which she gets, well, that's obvious. So that's been interesting. And then, I mentioned to you before the interview started that every summer I bring some undergraduate mainly engineering students, a couple of business students, to Israel, to Technion, to talk about innovation and technology and starting their own businesses.
Right.
And since we've been doing this now for 5 years, the second year she had never been to Israel, so I encouraged her to come with me. And not being a quiet person and loving to work with young people, she just got stuck into the program and helped all of the students dealing with the people side. So we've constantly developed new insights into how to help people deal with the challenge of innovation. And I think that's been the value of the program and the value of working together, because I think the issues are so complex that it's very difficult for one person to do it.
Yeah.
And when you're working in a tag team, even if you think you have the idea, the other person will challenge you. And so I think that's been interesting. So
that's true. So first of all, I think we have perhaps our next guest on the podcast, if your wife is willing. And I absolutely agree with you. I think, at the end of the day, I kind of feel today that, organizations in general have everything they need to be successful in innovation. But the one thing that screws them up every single time is it's people, it's dynamics, it's behavioral change. So I'm absolutely on point with you.
They underestimate that. So
that's true.
York University, which is in Toronto, we have a mandate from senior leadership to make our whole campus an innovation laboratory. where we do innovative things, and we teach and we do research and bring all those things together. And that's a mandate from the president. And we had somebody on campus with some new technologies that's basically turning organic material into energy. And he wants to help us build a facility here to showcase what he's doing and also to act for teaching and research and learning. And we spent the first half of the meeting talking about building engineering teams and the technological challenges, and was like halfway through the conversation that I talked about the fact that it's the behavioral challenges that are going to stop us from being successful, not the technical challenges. And so the senior leadership in the university is giving this message that this is important to do, and everyone's saying we're enthusiastic, and then they tell us 10 reasons why they can't do it. And so part of it is, and they are genuinely positive. They cannot see a different way. They get stuck. They can't see they can't see the benefits. They can't see how it's going to affect them positively or give them more time to do other things or change the nature of the dynamics in the workspace. You kind of have to hold their hand as they go through that change process to reduce fear, reduce the barriers to adoption. And that becomes a really interesting insight into the challenges. And, especially when it's all led by engineers, they just think, well, come up with a new technology. Everyone's going to come up.
Technology will solve everything. No, absolutely. I want to get back to talking about the different domains of innovation you operate in, and you wear several hats in academia and in government, business. I want to ask you, there's all this talk about open innovation and building ecosystems. Do these things work together? Should they work together? What has been your experience? And if you can give an example, a time that it's worked together, that'd be great.
I'm not sure I have examples of time it's worked together. I have more examples of where it hasn't worked
together. As well, that'd be good as well.
So let me give you an example that's really happening now. It's going to be a work in progress over the next 5 years, so we'll have to see the outcomes. But the Canadian government decided that it wanted to foster a bunch of superclusters, which it did based on technology and region of the country. And so in Ontario, which is where I'm located, they decided to create a supercluster around advanced manufacturing.
Okay.
And so basically they created an organization. They called out for a number of companies and universities and organizations to join it. They funded it with like $750 million or something. And they have all these companies and they all want to find ways to work together, but there is actually no mechanism for them working together. There's no forum for them exchanging ideas. There's nothing to change the dynamics and the relationships between companies. And so all they're doing is carrying on with business as usual, with a little bit of government money to help things, make maybe less rigorous decisions or de-risk decisions. They're not actually changing the nature of how we collaborate, how we work together, what we do. It's a good example of a problem. On the other hand, you asked for example of where things work together. There have been a bunch of research projects done at universities and where the funding was dependent on a collaborative approach from several different institutions where they changed the nature of how they would work together. And I think that's a really good example of doing something different. And, we talked earlier about the Israeli government funding of the entrepreneurship centers. The main reason that the Hebrew University was the most successful in that is because they identified what they were good at and what gaps they had, and they brought partners into their proposal. And those partners are an integral part of what they're doing. So I think innovation is inherently multidisciplinary and multi-perspective, and it only comes when you force people to change how they work with others. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson I've learned.
And so let's talk about this multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach. So it seems like it's definitely, one of the main characteristics that let's call it an innovator has to have. But do you think of any other ones that are as important?
I think we have to be careful when we use the word multidisciplinary. And the reason I say that is if you talk to an engineer about multidisciplinary, it means a mechanical engineer works with an electrical engineer. That's their definition of multidisciplinary. And, when we talk about multidisciplinary, what we really mean is people that look at perspectives and problems from completely different viewpoints, deal with different aspects of the problem, look at the human side. It goes back to a lot to, the principles of design thinking, understanding that at the end of the day, successful innovation requires adoption by the people that are going to do the new things. And that's a behavioral issue. It's a psychological issue.
Right.
It's just a different way of looking at things. So to some extent, someone whose whole life is spent developing a faster technology or a better technology or a cheaper technology may not be able to look at what they're solving, the problem they're working on, through that different lens. And
Right.
that's why when we talk about multidisciplinary, it's building together teams of people that have a common language, that can look at a problem and work on it together and respect each other's opinion and learn from the process.
Is it a supply chain issue? I mean, every person along the supply chain just sees their, one by one square, basically, right? And they don't get an overview of the entire supply chain. Is that something that you've experienced?
So absolutely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right to talk about it in terms of supply chain, because I think that's a very important perspective. I would also say ecosystem, in terms of fact that, when you're making a decision to change something, there are lots of different people involved that all have their different perspectives,
right?
And you have to get alignment across. So supply chain implies, a vertical supply chain. Ecosystem implies that there's other stakeholders. And
right.
so it's the ability to look at these things from the multiple perspectives that have to be involved in success. And because innovation involves changing things, it often involves changing 3 or 4 things simultaneously. And that's lots of opportunities for failure. So you need to be able to understand those issues and then anticipate them. And I think it's a different approach to looking at problems, to looking at challenges, to looking at innovation than we've traditionally done. Even the fact that I have no idea why we have faculties in university, or why we have departments. It doesn't, because the world isn't split up like that. We put that lens. I'm going to say we put that lens on it because it's easier for us from an administrative point of view. I can't see that it benefits students. So this kind of also goes to that issue that we embed some of these things into our thinking, and then it's difficult to look at it from a different perspective. Even organizational charts. I mean, I'm a professor of entrepreneurship, so typically the entrepreneur does everything.
Right.
If you get into corporate, people say, "Oh no, I'm not responsible for that. That's someone else's responsibility," and so that's where you get those breakdowns too.
Yeah. Do you think it's more difficult in academia versus, let's say, the business world to get people to collaborate? I mean, like you mentioned the Hebrew University and the grants the grant that they won, and the different grants that the 3 main universities in Israel won to create an innovation entrepreneurship center. But still, I mean, the challenge is still there. How do you break through those silos, right? You mentioned there are faculties. At the end of the day, there are faculties, and each faculty is responsible for teaching or doing X, and then contributing to the larger ecosystem, which is facilitated by this innovation center. They actually have to sacrifice some bandwidth.
I think it's a big challenge. I think the natural state of affairs is that people don't collaborate, partly because they're not encouraged to, partly because collaboration is more difficult, partly because they like being king of their own domain and they don't always get to be that if they're collaborating. And so, I would say that candidly, the only way that we can actually foster collaboration is by providing incentives. Right. And I think in academia, there's probably, 3. One is getting papers published. So you can collaborate with anybody you want on a paper, and you can have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 co-authors or whatever. So I think at that level, people can collaborate based on shared interest, and it doesn't take anything away. I think that you can get institutions or research projects to collaborate by funding different behaviors. In terms of we'll fund a joint research project between these 2 schools, but even then it gets to be difficult. And then I think the other part is how are people inside universities rewarded? And of course, there's a reward system attached to tenure and publications, but there are other rewards in universities. And I think that you have to look at the very simple level, how are people in the academic institutions rewarded? And are they rewarded for those types of collaborations? And the answer is generally not.
How's that different from business world in terms of incentives?
I think it's a really good question. And I think, honestly, I had the good fortune to spend a couple of years working in a US university. And in that university, they ask questions like, what's our role? Who are our competitors? How do we get students ahead of other places? And faculty are involved in those discussions and incented around those discussions. In Canada, that's not the case. We're kind of disconnected from, if you like, the business side of university.
Okay.
And so we spend a lot of time making decisions that maybe help us individually, but you cannot use this will help us get more students as a reason for doing something at university. When you go into the corporate world, and assuming that one classic difference is in the corporate world, most people have competition or are motivated by competition or increased financial performance, then it's somewhat easier to get this collaboration because you can point to a bottom line impact or an outcome, and so everyone in the company says this positive thing will be measured, and therefore, if you do that, in that way, then you can actually change people's behaviors. I have to tell you a story. We were trying to encourage a more innovative behavior in a very small company in Ontario. And the owner was in the room. There was like 20 people in the company. And I said, why don't you have an employee of the month and give them an incentive? And he said, well, we're a very small company. We don't have much money, blah, blah, blah. How can we give them an incentive? And I said, well, I happen to notice overhear a conversation on the way in here that you have season tickets to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And he goes, oh, yeah, we give those to customers. I said, so there's eight games a month, right, at home? There's 8 games a month. What about if you took one of those tickets that you normally go to customers and gave it to the employee of the month? How would that work? It doesn't cost you anything, right? Because you already got those tickets.
Right.
And he said, that's a great idea. So they tried it, and it was really, I was talking to him like 6 months later. He said, this was like the best idea ever. Everyone's motivated. They'll take their spouse or their kid or their significant other. They get the tickets. It's like a special recognition once a month for doing something really cool. And it doesn't cost me anything because I already have the tickets. And, so it's like, there's lots of examples of that. You can do things to incent people that the impact is much bigger than the cost.
Yeah, there's so much low-hanging fruit, I think, in corporations, organizations in general. I think people are always trying to overcomplicate things. It's got to be, AI, data-driven something, instead of just a very simple solution.
Absolutely. But I had a great example of that. So we did a workshop over the weekend for ophthalmologists.
Okay.
And we asked them, we used design thinking to improve the patient experience.
Okay.
And one of the teams said one of the biggest problems our patients have is they don't have very good vision. They're all elderly patients, and they have all these little bottles of eye drops that all look the same. And they're constantly not putting the right drops in it or the right time or remembering what to take, etc.
Yeah.
And so statement was, how could we redesign that bottle to enhance compliance? And they came up with 6 different ideas, and they were all good ideas. I don't know which were going to come forward. It was like, this is an industry that spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year on research and technology, and at the end of the day, the most innovative thing they came up with was just redesigning the bottle. And I thought that's a great example of something, of a simple approach that would solve a real problem when everyone else was going with very, very expensive solutions that were far too complex.
Yeah. All right. I want to ask you about trends, in your field, in your industry, in academia, innovation, entrepreneurship. What do you see happening?
I think that, in general, we see a lot more that people are actually trying to solve meaningful problems using technology. We tend to use the United Nations Sustainability Goals, as just a framework, and a lot of people are doing things that they think will impact on that. So I think that's one trend that we're seeing is people can see a big picture and they get motivated to work on a big problem, and even if they only play a small part in the solution. I think from a technological perspective, the biggest trend we're seeing is around AI and how it's going to change a whole load of current activities. We'll see how that plays out. Of all the new innovations that are having massive impact, that is the one we haven't scratched the surface of yet.
Everyone's kind of looking to see what happens with AI. I had the good fortune of studying with Marvin Minsky at MIT, and he, again, going back to complicated versus simple solutions, he always looked for the simplest solution, and he always talked about AI. in sort of the most pedestrian way. And it's funny
Yeah,
that I go into corporates now and I hear people speak about AI. And these people who are not trained in AI, right? They have no AI
right.
background, but they sort of adopted the lingo. And it's always funny because, at the end of the day, there's a simple, sort of straightforward way of talking about AI.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's also, it's like, in this industry, especially when it's looking at entrepreneurship and funding, there
Mhm.
are fashions and trends, and oh, if you don't have an AI company in your portfolio, then
Yeah.
you're in trouble. There is a lot of that. I mean, we have a program in Canada called Next AI, which is for early stage AI companies,
Hmm.
and I teach in that program. And first of all, I mean, I think they're all high potential companies, but many of them are not really using the potential of AI. They just use it as a kind of buzzword to describe the fact they're doing something new that has some clever software inside what they're doing, but it's not really AI. So some of the buzz around AI is not real yet.
I really think that people are having the wrong conversation about that these days, about what
Yep.
is AI. You mentioned people, coming together and becoming incentivized by the impact. How do you measure that?
That's a very good question, and I don't think I really have a good answer for that. I can tell you
Mhm.
in the educational system, when we're doing things like startup weekends and competitions and things like that, we kind of give marks for they address one of the sustainability challenges, and if they do, then that's perceived as good because it has a high impact. Whether that does actually have a high impact or not, it's kind of difficult to see at the early stage. It's more, and I would say at the moment it's more an aspiration. And then, of course, if they actually end up having a technology that's used or a technology that leads to a venture, then the impact is always seen in the economic performance of that venture or that technology. There is definitely some interesting things around that. And I think the other thing that's interesting, I think, is the difference between Canada and the US. I
Okay.
think impact in the US is much more associated with dollars and cents. And I think
Mhm.
in Canada, it's less associated with dollars and cents. It's not that it doesn't
Interesting.
exist. People will measure the value they're contributing to society
Hmm.
more in dollars and cents in the States. In Canada, they'll talk about, social impact or other things that they're doing as well.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's a cultural thing.
And it's also interesting how it changes from ecosystem to ecosystem
Yeah.
and try to characterize a certain ecosystem. Each one sort of behaves different.
Yeah, you're right. And I think, I mean, I talk about the States, but I'm very, very aware that that looks very different if you're in Boston or if you're in
Mhm.
New Orleans.
Yeah,
The ecosystem in those two places is very different.
very
I mean,
different.
there are similarities, but
Yeah.
what's going on, how people work, and even how people collaborate. I mean, Richard Florida did all this stuff on innovative communities
Hmm.
and talked
Right.
about what creates those innovative communities. And I think some of those things are really interesting. That and they vary from literally one city to the next. I was working at the University of Toronto,
Mhm.
and 100 kilometers down the road is the University of Waterloo.
Right.
And I did my PhD at Waterloo because they were just doing entrepreneurship and U of T wasn't doing entrepreneurship. And it was difficult to understand why. And I'm not sure I have simple answers, but after 7 years at Waterloo, I began to understand why. So it
Mm.
is local. It's not as a national characteristic that does one thing or the other.
I want to ask you about your role specifically, your typical day. What does it look like?
Well, I don't think I really have a typical day. I mean, typically I'm working with a couple of industry partners. I'm working with I have a lab here at York that has startups in it. So I'm working with a couple of startups. Usually I'm planning some new big initiative. I mentioned there was one today that's turning organic waste into energy. That's a
Mhm.
campus-wide project. So we have people from multiple disciplines there working on some, stakeholder activities and obviously teaching. I don't think I have a typical day. I think if I had a typical day, I'd get bored. There's a lot of research around entrepreneurship and ADD. It's interesting because people with ADD, they tend to have two things. First of all, they don't have a long attention span and they like starting more things than they finish. But they
Right.
also see connections that people without ADD don't see. How do you
Yeah.
capture that in a way that is useful and interesting? And so part of the challenge for people with any type of, I'm going to call it a disability, some of us would call it an ability, but
You're right.
with a characteristic, how do you learn to manage that yourself? How do you learn to use that to improve your effectiveness If you just ignore it, or even if you try and hide it, usually it won't work out. But you need to think about what challenges you have and then see how you can use those to improve your impact.
I agree 100%. So I want to, just before we wrap up, get your thoughts on best way for corporate to take advantage or work with, collaborate with academia.
So I think it's a very good question, actually one that we're spending a lot of time thinking about, because we do professional executive education here, and I teach in those programs. I mentioned the ophthalmologist one I did over the weekend. The reality is that there is a benefit to having a bunch of people from the same company together in a learning environment, right? Because they can say, here's a common set of rules and values and frameworks and tools and processes that we all use. And what are the challenges we have and how can we adopt them? And even, a technique. And so I think there's definite value in doing that. I think there are other things, maybe, for example, design thinking as a concept, that there's value in having both people that are really familiar with this, subject matter experts, come in to do it, and also having people from different organizations, because different backgrounds, because you get this the diversity thing that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I think that organizations looking at education of their executives, let's say that for the corporate academy, need to really try to understand what it is that they're trying to do with them, and that the answer should never be we only teach people inside the corporate academy or we only send people outside, but that most people should be exposed to a variety, but understanding what the value is. So, for example, I run one that's inside a big company, a big engineering company, and they have a big challenge with corporate culture. And reality is, I don't think you could have that conversation with people that weren't in that corporate culture, right? I think they wouldn't understand, or you would feel uncomfortable sharing it. And people were talking about it not because they were complaining; they were just saying, "How do I do this within our corporate culture? How do I do this within our corporate culture?" So I think there's massive values of those things. I think some things are better where you have people from different organizations come together. And so I think that people need to look at what they've been doing and say, is this the best way to deliver this learning experience for our people, and what do we want to achieve by it? And I think the other thing to add, which is something that is we're really struggling with at the university level, but I think in 5 years' time we'll have figured it out, is what is the content that we should just provide in terms of online courses, and that people can go back and refer to again and check their understanding by doing a simple quiz, versus what is the experiential learning that you really need to do in a group environment. And also linked to that, can you do any of that experiential learning through an online environment?
Yeah, that's
and
tough.
I think people need to re-examine that. And I would say that most professors think the best way to teach is the way that they were taught 20 years ago. And that's probably not likely to be the case. I would say the same is probably true in corporate academy. And therefore, how do we help the people that really want to teach, do a good job, appreciate, understand the different ways they may offer that learning experience in a way that adds value and uses what the tools are now. Every week I'm learning something new that I add into my class, because I'm always the innovator. So with my ADD won't let me stay still. So I have to go find something new.
I think that's a perfect answer. And I always like an episode where we end with more questions than answers. That's always a good sign, because we don't know everything. And we're, like you said, we're innovators and we're trying to find answers all the time. So that was a great answer. So finally, if people listening to this want to reach out and talk to you, what would be the best way to do that?
The best email is andrewlmaxwell@gmail.com. Or if they want to look at my lab at the university, it's BEST Lassonde, BEST, which stands for Bergeron Entrepreneurs in Science and Technology, BEST Lassonde, LASSONDE.ca. Or I'm on LinkedIn, and it's not that hard to find me.
Perfect. I like that acronym, by the way, BEST. Great. I'll link all of that in the description in the show notes. And again, I want to thank you, Andrew, for taking the time and answering these questions. And thank you.
You're very welcome, and I think the challenges you're asking questions about, that interface of government, academia, and industry, is one that is more questions than answers, but more discussing will help us move along the path of learning about it.
Okay, that was my conversation with Andrew Maxwell. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next week.